podcast where higher education leadership meets real world insight. I'm Rosemarie Sloan, and each week I talk with visionary academic leaders who are shaping the future of colleges and universities. Whether you're an emerging leader or a seasoned executive, this show is your go-to space for candid conversations on leading with purpose in our rapidly evolving landscape. Today, I have the pleasure of being joined by Dr. Paula Checchi, Dean of STEM at Las Positas College in Livermore, California. Paula is a purpose-driven leader with over 2 decades of experience in faculty mentorship, curriculum innovation, and academic transformation. Together, we'll dive into what it means to lead with clarity, courage, and strategy. One conversation at a time, let's think forward. Hi, Paula. How are you?
Great. Hi, Rose. How are you today?
I am good. It's wonderful to be with you, and I'm so excited about this conversation. As we get started, is there something that you'd like to share with those that are listening?
No, I'm really excited to talk to everyone. It's been a not a very straight path to get into the role I'm in now. So I'm really hoping that people feel inspired and maybe relieved that I didn't take the straightforward path in my career. And I'm excited to
Yeah.
talk to you.
Great. Well, let's dive into that. You mentioned I didn't take the straight path in my career. So you've had a leadership journey. And like any journey, we know there's windy roads. We know that there's blue skies and kind of that brown grass that we see at times. So talk a little bit about your leadership journey, what you've learned, and where you've been challenged.
All right, great. Well, to tell you about my journey, I'm probably going to have to tell you a little bit about my background. So I started out as a bench scientist. I got my PhD. I started when I was just turned 22 years old, and I was studying developmental biology. I
Mm,
did a postdoctoral fellowship at UC Davis.
wow.
And my background through my mid 30s was solely teacher and researcher of genetics and molecular biology. So
Mm,
during this time, I learned that I love teaching and students. This is something I've known for many years, but I really loved solving problems, and I love
mm.
really hard problems that no one else could figure out. So that was really my jam. So I spent really years of thinking, okay, what do I want to do when I wind up in my 40s? And this was,
Mm,
my mid late 30s. That 40th birthday was coming up. And I thought about it, and eventually I wound up making the jump. And during the pandemic, I shifted and I left my tenured position to work as an educational administrator. So my
great.
first role was down at a graduate program in San Diego. I was hired as a program manager. I was then a program director. And I came into this role thinking I was really prepared. I understood what it was like to be a grad student. I understood what it was like to be a new faculty, but as an administrator, my role was entirely different. I,
Mhm.
the big thing was for many years, I had such a narrow focus. And my
Mm,
thinking was, okay, these are my problems. How do
mm,
I solve these big problems? And I could usually
right.
predict what would happen, and I also would know what kind of problems I would arise. So, for example, my problems in my 30s were my research funding didn't come through, a manuscript wasn't accepted. When I was teaching, an
Oh,
entire class might have failed an exam. But then in my first leadership role, I worked in a small team with a lot of responsibilities.
mm,
So now these problems became a group problem, and I didn't always agree with everyone. So
yeah.
this was something that was really new to me, and I didn't think there would be such a change, but there really was. Thankfully, as I became an administrator, I also was able to undergo lots of different leadership training, and there was role playing. But what I still really struggle with as a leader, I would say, is recognizing that I actually can't solve all of the problems. So I started off by saying I became a leader because I really like solving problems and I describe myself
Right.
as good at it. But now the big problems often they're halted. They're not something that I can solve today. I have a
Hmm.
lot of them. So it's a real shift in mindset. So it's
Yes.
something where I'm challenged. I didn't expect to see myself navigating some of these problems. It's hard for me
Hmm.
not to make immediate decisions, especially if I can see, okay, this will solve this. But instead, I think about things a lot more farsighted. And the reason why is I know my actions no longer focus entirely on the present and immediate future, but they're really more in the long term. So it's a lot of consciously quieting the urge to be reactive and as a leader to think about, okay, what is the outcome that I'm looking for, and going from problem solver to more vision setter, I would say.
Hmm.
So that's kind of where I'm at. I'm leadership journey. The other thing I would add that I still struggle with, this is now my, I guess, fifth year in a leadership
Mm-hmm.
role, probably delegation. A lot
Mm.
of people come to me and they can all do tasks. And there's a different change in pacing because my urge is always to just get things accomplished. And when I have, over 100 direct reports, recognizing, okay, I actually do need to let people do their job. It's not my
Right.
job. It's my job to make sure that they have the tools to do their job, and seeing
Yeah.
myself in the role as a coach and a lot of different things I never did before when I was just working, as a faculty or as a student. It's a lot of
Yeah.
is
Wow, you are an incredibly reflective, very introspective leader to have that much knowledge, just from looking at what you've done, but also from just taking some quiet moments and being able to not only recognize but empathize that you've really done so much in a short period of time. It's very inspiring to hear. And you mentioned that you have about 130. I think in our prior conversation, we talked about your large number of people who report to you, and at your college, about 9,000 students, and everything you do in that STEM field. You mentioned on your journey that you've overcome challenges and that you've had to learn to delegate and how you're going to manage tasks and lead forward. That's what I heard you talking about. And I'm sure that you've experienced some blind spots. If you could identify one, what would that be? Your biggest leadership blind spot so far?
Oh, probably I identify as an introvert. So coming into a leadership role, I was very naive about what the organizational politics would be, and really
Oh,
navigating these complex hierarchies. So I came in thinking, okay, I have all these transferable skills. This is going to work. But I really didn't have any idea what the inner workings of an academic institution are. And still I'm learning that. I've been a dean just over a year at Las Positas College, and there are things that are still a black box to me.
yeah.
Everything is a lot more nuanced. And in this space, I've found it's really important to develop relationships with my peers. So
Mhm.
the other deans, the vice president, the president, and that's not something that comes naturally to me. I know it's super important, but I'm still really figuring out this space because that's a challenge.
Yeah. I hear what you're saying, and I also admire the recognition of how important that that work gets done with and through others. And so building those relationships is really forward thinking, because if you're going to delegate, if you're actually going to make progress, drive results, you're going to get that done with and through others. And so when we think about the traditions of higher education and we want to lead towards transformation, think about how you're challenged with the traditional part of higher education, but the transformational needs moving us into the future. What does that look like for you?
Yeah, that's a great question. And one of the things that's fantastic about being in the community college system is we're really set up to do just that. I spent a lot of my life in, actually, I spent all of my life in academia, but I've spent a lot of my life in situations. So I was doing my PhD. There's really only one path, and it was get your PhD, become a
Hmm.
researcher, continue on. Um, and that was it. But I think we are a lot more forward thinking, particularly about non-traditional career paths and workforce modernization. And the reason for that is at the community college level, we serve everyone. So
Yeah.
anyone can apply. People
Hmm.
can, in certain cases, take college classes completely for free. Yeah, we are very different than a four-year university where you're expected to go through really rigid paths, but
Yeah.
instead, workforce demands are something I think about all the time because they're
Of
far
course.
from static in STEM, and it's really important to be thinking ahead. So, what skills will employers want in the future? So, I spent a lot of time on industry advisory boards, talking to people in the industry, and what they want from our students. So to ensure that they're prepared, especially when they're all coming from so many different backgrounds and they have so many different
Correct.
goals. So some are here
Right.
to complete an associate's degree, transfer to a bachelor's and continue on. Others are here to upskill. Others are here to gain a certificate. So it's really different than the students you would serve and their paths at any of the four-year colleges. And I actually love that. I think that that's really exciting.
It sounds really exciting, and it's refreshing to hear you talk in this way. You are really thinking about the needs of the students and how we're going to, quote, make this happen. And I'm sure with everything that's going on at your college at Las Positas, and in California, with so many changes and how education is just really evolving, and I see you smiling on that when I say that, I am sure you are experiencing, not just at your college, but I know across higher education, so much resistance to some of the change that's coming as we continually evolve. Um, how do you deal with resistance? And how do you support your team, these 135 reports, as you experience this change?
Honestly, I do a lot of listening and I don't do a lot of talking. So that's something that it was a big shift for me. I really thought it was important to have these conversations back and forth to explain. And instead, really one of the best pieces of advice when I stepped into this role was listen to hear, not to respond. I spend a
Oh,
lot of time listening to
I
what
love
the
that.
concerns are. And sometimes, they're not going to immediately change their minds, but if someone
Mhm.
feels heard first, eventually that we'll be able to have a conversation and potentially they'll be able to shift the mindset. But mindset is not something that's going to change immediately. And again, with 130 plus direct
Mhm.
reports, all who have very different personalities, it's it's going to be a lot of different conversations that I have.
Absolutely.
There's a lot of emotional labor I didn't realize have coming into this role. And I think there's just this resistance that if you don't do things a certain way, things are just going to implode. But in
Mhm.
order to grow and be innovative, there's an element of risk. I think that there's a lot of tension between institutional
Ah,
tradition and adaptability. And people don't often like change. I didn't like change when I was a faculty. I did not like change. I didn't like being told how to do things. So I think about what would have worked for me, and someone having a conversation and telling me how to do something wasn't going to be effective. What might have been effective was someone letting me talk. And then maybe after a couple of different conversations down the road, I might be able to see their perspective. So
right.
that's something where I really try to get buy-in. I'd say I'm a very affiliation oriented leader where I like to make sure that people feel heard, that I'm able to hear things from their perspective, and that's how I get change made. I've been a dean for
Wonderful.
a year, and I think I have a really great relationship with our faculty and our staff, but it takes a lot of work and a lot of listening.
Well, with your philosophy of leadership just screaming out in the words that you're using, the listen to be heard, I believe is so incredibly important. I often find that people listen in order to respond as opposed to listen to really hear someone and let them give voice to their concern. And I know that there are a lot of things that you may be concerned about as an academic leader, as a dean of STEM, in your college, and thinking about higher education as a whole. But what I'm also hearing is that you understand that you can influence in so many ways. And while you might not be able to have control over the things that you want to have control over, you have influence. And so, with all of your team members and your ability to really hear what they're saying, let's talk a little bit about why we're here, and that's the students. How we make students a priority. So what are you hearing across your organization or with your team members in terms of making students a priority and knowing, ensuring that they have the resources and the support they need to succeed? What's going on with you in your department on your campus?
That's a really great question. I think everyone who is here at the college has that goal is they're here to support students. And if they're not here to support students, they're in the wrong career. This is not a career where you make a ton of money. We do it because we love students and we
Mm-hmm.
love seeing them succeed. In terms of supporting students, a lot of it's just seeing how we can do that with the resources we have. So I would say a lot of the resistance I get from faculty are they want to come in and they want to build programs. Sometimes that actually comes from other administrators too, where I get a lot of pressure to build new programs, bring in funding. And I try to be very careful with making sure that we have the bandwidth to do the things that we're suggesting. Do we have the resources? And I spend a lot of time really carefully thinking about how we're going to navigate these
Mm.
decisions. Students also have really great ideas for what they want. Unfortunately, we don't always have all of those resources. So I try to really be creative and innovative and meet students where they're at, hear them out, and see what things I can do. And if there's something that can support them that doesn't involve them being on our campus, I look to our
Mm.
industry partners and other people who I have relationships with, and I can put them in touch with them. And it's about being really creative, I would say. It's not having a one size fits all guide. And in fact, there's no guidebook at all to being a dean. Things I've learned. You just move
Right.
into this role. You don't have an instruction manual. And so I'm here because I love students. I want to support them. But each is a really different case. And what I'm going to be able to do is dependent on a lot of different factors.
Absolutely. You talk a lot about, we know why we're here. We're here to support students. And I think that when you look across any institutional vision, student success is right at the heart of it, and how we are going to build an environment that's engaged and that's very welcoming for our students. How do we retain students? I've actually heard that that's the new enrollment strategy, is how do we retain our students and help them through on their path, whatever their path may be.
Right.
How do we focus on that? There are times, however, that we in academics, we across higher education organizations, lose sight of our institutional vision.
All
I
right.
walk into many, when I'm helping to develop leaders, I walk into organizations, and one of the first questions I ask is, share with me your vision. And a lot of times leaders can't do that in any level position, regardless of the seat we're sitting in. It's my belief that everyone at the organization, throughout the institution, needs to know what the institutional vision is, as well as the strategic goals. So, can you share with us a time when either you, your department, your team has lost sight of the institutional vision and how you recalibrated?
I'm not sure that we've really lost sight of it. It's just how we are still going to uphold the mission of the college. And the mission of the college is something it's really important to me. It's why I came here. It's an equity focused, student centered college. Without getting into any politics, I'll just say that, there were some changes this year. And
Yes.
what changes did we actually need to make? It turned out there were really few. That we actually had to do. A lot of it's because we're state funded, and I don't
Mm-hmm.
want to go too much in that path. But bringing faculty back to the common goal of why we're here and what we all think is really important. How are we serving our students? And for this particular year, I would say the things I think about a lot and I have conversations with are about equity. How do we continue to focus on equity with the constraints that we have? How
Mm-hmm.
do we continue to be aware of student mental health? That's something that's really important to me.
Incredibly
An
important.
entire podcast on mental health. In fact,
Yes.
I'm meeting non-traditional student needs. That's something where I think you can lose sight, and it's just about, okay, what
Absolutely.
what are the resources we have? What are the opportunities? How do we deal with this within the landscape that we have? Career development beyond academia. So those are the conversations I have a lot. And I would say, we haven't really lost sight of the mission, but sometimes there's just a lot of fear, and how will we still how do we remain equity focused and student
Mm-hmm.
centered when we don't know what kind of challenges we're up against?
Right. I don't hear so much recalibration. What I hear is bringing the conversation to the forefront and asking the question. And what I also hear you saying is that, I may not have all the answers, but wow, I'm going to make sure that I put that question on the table and we find a way to have a conversation around it. And it
Right.
takes me back to something that I said earlier. This starts with one conversation at a time, over time. At some point, though, we need to make a decision on what we're going to do. And in academia, I find at times we meet a lot, but on the agenda, it's not now we're going to decide after we've had collaboration, we've seen the data, we've heard from the representatives that we need to hear from. Now's the time to make a decision. And I know that frustrates people. And so, how do you deal with that?
Um, that is really frustrating, and I always was frustrated myself when I was faculty. I came to these meetings, I wanted a decision. Um, I think it's really getting buy-in and identifying who the stakeholders are.
Yeah.
I used to think it was important to include every single person in every division, but every decision rather. Decisions now are made based on the people who need to be involved in
Hmm.
making those decisions. I think it's important for everyone to have a voice and hear, but
Yes.
ultimately, it can get a little bit complicated when we have that many voices
Right.
that wind up actually making that decision. So I will listen. I will always take into consideration everyone's thoughts, but when it comes down to making the decision, it's not everyone needs to be involved at that stage. And
Right.
knowing kind of, I guess, the timeline, and just being, when I write an agenda for a meeting that's my entire division, which is over 100 people, I
Yeah.
really present things in a pretty broad fashion. I don't do a lot of small details. I save those for meetings that are one-on-ones or with small
Hmm.
groups. And I try to be really transparent that we're actually not going to have a decision at the end of this meeting. We are taking input. I'm sharing. I'll answer any questions you have, but there's not going to be decisions that are made in a meeting where
Right.
there's over 100 of us in there. It's really for us to share what our thoughts are and where we're at, and to debrief.
That level of transparency, really stating your intent. My intent today is for us to come together and have a collaborative conversation. No
Right.
decision will be made, but voices will be heard. And at times we just need to have that opportunity to do that in an environment where we feel safe,
I
to
agree.
have some healthy debate, conflict, and talk about what is possible. I'm a big fan of taking a problem and flipping it into a possibility. We know what we can't do, so what can we do? And then
Right.
starting that conversation. I also like putting the student at the, just right in the center of the table as we're thinking and collaborating and starting to think about making a decision. You have mentioned that you've been in your dean role for a short period of time, and you are learning and listening along the way, figuring out ways to think forward. So, as you continue to grow and develop as a dean, as a leader, as a human, what are your goals?
All right. I would say one of my goals is just to be able to set better boundaries between myself, realize and give myself some grace to know that it's okay, even though I'm saying I've told you already that I don't solve problems right away, to
Right.
really continually remind myself that,
Mhm.
I might ask my partner and I say when we get home from work, that's a tomorrow problem, and to
Ah,
really be okay with that because I always have this perfectionism. I think a lot of people do. I always like to make sure that when I'm my one on one with my boss, I now report to our vice president, that I have solutions and to recognize that I can lean on other people.
right.
I just had my one on one today with our VP, and she always asks me, how can I support you? And it took me a long time to realize she actually does want me to be giving
Right.
her some suggestions on things she can be doing, and I don't need to come in with the answers. So that's something that's really important for me. I would say, as I've been a dean for, as you said, a year,
Yeah.
and to recognize that the deans who have been here much longer, they often don't have the answers, and I'm not expected to come in knowing everything. So
Right.
that's a challenge, and I'm working on it.
Well, I think it's not just a challenge for you. I think it's a challenge for a lot of people that find themselves in the type of leadership role that you're finding yourself in. I think we're challenged regardless of where we sit in the organization. I love that you mentioned that you're not perfect and you give yourself grace and compassion for that understanding. I often say that I am perfectly imperfect. And so
Yeah.
welcome over to my box of being perfectly imperfect. And I'm hoping those that are listening are laughing and agreeing that we're all in this way as we figure out our way forward. So as we wrap up here today, you really sound like you lead with influence and that you are searching for ways to be a more transformative leader.
Right.
What would you like to do at this point in your career to continue to develop in a very transformational way? So you are individualizing, you're considering, you're encouraging, you're inspiring, all of those things that we define transformational leadership by.
Yeah, so I think it's really important to still continue having training throughout our careers. And we talked a little about this in our last conversation. Having
Right.
coaching is really important. So to develop executive presence, system thinking. I started using coaching when I transitioned over to my job now, and I really wish I did it a lot sooner. I've
Mhm.
used coaching before. I'm an athlete. I've had coaches there. I recognize
Mhm.
how important they are. And I really had not thought about having a career coach. And to me, it's analogous really to having a therapist to work through my life problems. If these are career problems, my partner is there to validate and listen, but it's a
Right.
completely different perspective you get from a paid professional. And I
Absolutely.
feel really the exact same way about my career. So having coaching to be able to be successful, especially right now, I'm in a middle senior leadership role.
Right.
And some of the things I'm really looking for in continued training are, say, training in difficult conversations, leading through conflict. It's
Mm.
something I've worked extensively on multiple trainings that I've done in the past, but
Yeah.
I wish I started doing it sooner. And, these topics that I've discussed before in trainings that they really reinforce how unpredictable the situations can be. So no
Wow.
matter how
Yeah.
many role playing exercises I've done, and I'm in my car and I talk to myself, it never fully prepares me for what will come up. And then just to even get back to the very first question we talked about leadership, recognizing the emotional labor of leadership
Yes.
and managing people's fears and ambitions and campus politics. That's something that I am continually trying to figure out. And I really lean upon others to make sure I'm navigating that in an appropriate way and in a way where it's going to facilitate my growth and also be really helpful
Right.
for those who I am leading.
You know, you gave some really great advice to leaders out there in terms of continuing to develop yourself. I find that leaders go to, across any industry, different training opportunities, which I highly endorse. But coaching is so important. Really having the group environment and then that one-on-one thought partner who's going to be, you know, the way I think about coaching is that external thought disruptor, someone who's going to sit there with you and not do therapy, but someone who's going to challenge you by
Yeah.
turning and flipping that problem into a possibility. I'm a firm believer of coaching the person
Yeah.
through the problem. And that's what I'm hearing you say. And you've been fortunate to at least have started that. I wish you so much
Thank you.
success as you continue to grow and develop in your young deanship, as they say.
Thank you.
Any final thoughts as we wrap up this segment of Think Forward?
No, Rose, this has really been fantastic. Thank you so much. I've really enjoyed getting to speak with you, and it just really
Oh.
validates my decisions to move into leadership roles, and I'm excited to continue.
There are so many leaders just like you out there who may be new to their role and they are challenged in ways that they didn't expect to be challenged. And I find, as I will say this word again, you refreshing because you're so transparent and open and honest, and yet your energy is just really contagious. And so you've inspired me today. I'm hoping that you've inspired others. As I said, I wish you much success. And thank you again for being part of Think Forward.
Thank you so much. Have a wonderful day. Take care.